The gates of Winterhold rose like teeth against the star-eaten sky, iron and stone twisted into the memory of every pack that had bent before them. Kale's knees gave first, then her pride. The snow beneath her was no longer white, but stained with the red of her own choosing, the blood she'd spilled to escape the Northmere pack, the blood that now marked her as rogue, as traitor, as something no alpha would claim. The collar around her neck was cold iron. That part had not changed. She'd torn it once, years ago, when she was still believing in mercy. The scar tissue still pulled at the base of her skull, a constant reminder that defiance and freedom were not the same thing. The Northmere elders had laughed as they welded a new one, tighter, heavier, inscribed with runes that meant property of the North. They said Omegas like her, rebellious, marked by the old gods, unwilling to submit, needed the weight to keep them docile. She'd worn it for 7 years. But 2 nights ago, something had cracked inside her, not her spine, not her will, something older, something that remembered she had teeth. The alpha of Northmere, Gareth, had chosen a new mate, a compliant Omega from the eastern reaches, one who smiled when commanded and lowered her eyes when spoken to. Kyle had watched from the kitchens as they announced it in the great hall. She'd watched Gareth's hand touch the new Omega's cheek with the tenderness he'd never shown to anyone. And somewhere in her chest, a door had opened that should have remained sealed. She wasn't jealous. That would have been simpler. She was furious. Furious that she'd wasted 7 years waiting for an alpha who saw her as a problem to be managed. Furious that she'd been born Omega in a world that demanded she apologize for her own existence. Furious that the gods had marked her with the old sight, the ability to read the threads of fate in bloodstains and moonlight, and cursed her to hide it beneath a collar meant for lesser creatures. So she'd run, and they'd hunted her. The wound in her side was deep but not fatal. She'd made sure of that before she fled. The blade she'd taken from the armory was still tied to her ribs with strips of her own dress, the iron warm against her skin. She'd made it this far, across the northern pass, through the shattered forest, all the way to the gates of Winterhold, on nothing but spite and the old words her grandmother had whispered to her before the Northmere pack had erased her name from memory. The blood of the first Omegas runs in your veins. They chose mercy, and the gods chose them. Never forget. But mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The gates of Winterhold were sealed. Of course they were. It was midnight, the hour when even kings slept. The wind carried the scent of pine and something older, something that made her wolf half tremble. Ancient magic. The kind that predated the hierarchies of Alpha and Omega, the kind that whispered from the stones themselves. Kale's vision was beginning to blur at the edges. The fever from the wound was rising, or perhaps it was simply that her body had finally realized she'd pushed it beyond the threshold of endurance. She'd been running for 4 days. She'd eaten nothing but snow and the raw meat of a rabbit she'd killed with her bare hands, tasting the fear blood and the wild in it. She collapsed against the gates with her palms flat, as if she could push her way into sanctuary through sheer will. The iron was cold. The snow was colder. And then, nothing. The morning came the way all mornings come to those who might not see another. Quietly, without permission, indifferent to whether you deserved it. Kyle's first conscious thought was that she was warm. That was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Her side should be burning. Her throat should be cracked and raw from screaming. The collar around her neck should still be cutting into her skin, the runes digging in like tiny teeth. But instead, there was warmth, firelight, and the scent of something she'd learned long ago not to trust, safety. Her eyes opened to a chamber that belonged to another world. The walls were stone, yes, but they seemed almost alive, veined with silver that caught the light from 1,000 candles. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to park a carriage in, and above it hung a tapestry depicting a wolf crowned in moonlight, its eyes the color of old blood. The bed beneath her was furs and silk, the kind of luxury that Omega bitches in the service wings only whispered about. She tried to sit up. Her body refused. That's when she noticed the man. He was sitting in a chair by the window, silhouetted against the pale northern light. Tall, broad-shouldered in the way of alphas who'd spent their whole lives carrying the weight of crowns and empires. His hair was dark silver, the color of starlight on steel, and his eyes, God's, his eyes, were the exact shade of the wolf in the tapestry above the fire. Those eyes were watching her with the careful attention of someone studying a wild thing that might bite. "You shouldn't be alive," he said. His voice was quiet, dangerous in the way that silence is dangerous. Kale's hand moved to her side reflexively, but there was no wound. The fever sweat on her skin was gone. She was wearing a sleeping tunic of fine linen, and beneath it, where the blade had buried itself deep, there was nothing but smooth skin and the faint silver trace of a scar already half healed. "What did you—" She started, but her voice cracked like old leather. "Water," the man said, and he rose from the chair with the fluid grace of an alpha in his own territory. He moved to a table near the bed, and she caught the scent of him then, pine and snow and smoke, ancient and powerful. Her wolf half recognized him before her human mind could process the danger of it. Royal blood. Unmistakable, the kind of alpha that packs were built around. He held out a cup. She took it with shaking hands, desperate enough to ignore the small voice in her head screaming that this was a trap. The water was cold and perfect, and she drained it like it was the last thing she'd ever taste. "The collar," she said, her voice still broken but growing stronger. "It's gone." "It is," the man agreed. He was watching her again, his expression unreadable. "I removed it this morning. The mechanism was old, iron-locked, sealed with blood runes from at least 3 decades past." Kale's hand flew to her neck. The skin there was tender, marked with the pale impression of where the metal had bitten, but it was free, genuinely free. She had to consciously stop herself from crying out, a sound somewhere between relief and terror. "Why?" she asked. The man returned to his chair, but he didn't sit. Instead, he stood before her, and the firelight caught his face fully for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought. Not old, but marked with the particular exhaustion that comes from ruling something vast and merciless. There were scars on his jaw, his throat, his hands. And in his eyes there was something that looked almost like recognition. "Because," he said quietly, "the moment you collapsed at my gates, I saw your blood in the snow, and I recognized the runes on your collar. I know that pack. I know what they do to Omegas who refuse to break." He paused. His gaze moved to her neck, to the angry red marks that would fade within days. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost reverent. "More importantly, I felt it the moment you fell. The old magic, the kind that doesn't manifest in 1 Omega in 1,000 generations." He stepped closer. "You're a pathfinder." Kyle's blood went cold. That word, that title, was forbidden. It was older than the hierarchies of Alpha and Omega, older than the packs themselves. It meant she was a bridge between worlds, a reader of fate threads, a keeper of the gods' secrets. In the Northmere pack, they would have burned her for it if they'd known the full extent of it. They'd kept her alive only because her visions had occasionally proven useful to their raids. "How could you possibly—" she began. "Because I am one as well," he said, and then, extending his hand, "My name is Theron. I am the Alpha King of Winterhold, and I believe, despite all reason, that the gods have sent you to me at precisely the moment I was about to stop believing in gods at all." His hand remained extended. In the candlelight, she could see the faint silver scars that marked him too, the same marks that would now be appearing on her own skin, where the old magic recognized the old magic. By morning, she'd already borne the royal mark. And Kyle, for the first time in 7 years, had no idea whether to run or to finally, impossibly, stay. Theron left her alone for the first time at midday, and Cale spent the silence trying to understand what had happened to her in the hours before dawn. The chamber was gilded with luxury, but she could see the careful architecture of a cage beneath it. The windows were high and barred, not overtly, but the metal strips were there if you looked closely. The door was locked from the outside. There were no weapons within arm's reach, nothing sharp enough to be dangerous. Even the pitcher beside the bed was ceramic, designed to break harmlessly if thrown. She was a prisoner, a comfortable one, but a prisoner nonetheless. She'd moved to the window and looked out over the city of Winterhold, spread across the frozen valley like a scar. The snow here was different from the snow of the north, bluer somehow, more deliberate. The buildings were hewn from stone that seemed to glow from within, and the streets were laid in patterns that made her wolf sight ache. Those were power lines, she realized. Ley lines, the old magic made visible to those who had eyes to see them. A pathfinder's eyes. She'd been touching the window when the knock came. The woman who entered was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who'd spent her life in service to something greater than herself. Her hair was bound in intricate braids woven with silver thread, and her eyes held the same ancient intelligence as Theron's, though hers were softer, less burdened. "I'm Sarah," the woman said without preamble, "the Alpha King's sister and the healer of Winterhold. I've been asked to ensure you're recovering without complication." Kyle didn't move from the window. "Am I allowed to refuse?" she asked. Sarah smiled, a small, genuine expression that suggested she respected the question. "You're allowed to do many things. Whether those things result in freedom or deeper captivity depends on how you navigate the next few days." There was honesty in that. Cale turned from the window and allowed the examination. Sarah's hands were warm as she checked the scars on Cale's neck, her side, the places where the old magic had begun to manifest as silver lines beneath the skin. She made small humming sounds, her head tilted in concentration. "You've been marked by the Northmere pack for a long time," Sarah observed. It wasn't a question. 7 years, Kyle said flatly. 7 years is a long time to carry rage, Sarah replied. "The fact that you survived it at all suggests you're stronger than you know." She stepped back, her assessment complete. "The king thinks highly of you already, which is remarkable because he thinks highly of almost no one. He's been hurt too many times to afford sentiment." "Why did he remove my collar?" Kyle asked. "Why not just turn me away? A rogue Omega at his gates is nothing but complication." Sarah moved to the fire, warming her hands. When she spoke, her voice was careful, deliberate. "My brother has been waiting for someone for a very long time. 3 years ago, our Pathfinder, the one who read the threads of fate for this kingdom, was killed in an assassination meant for the king. Since then, the crown has been without guidance. The ley lines have been growing chaotic. The winter has lasted longer than it should. The natural order has been questioning itself." She turned back to face Cale fully. "And then you arrived, bleeding at the gates, marked with the old magic so strong that even the unaware among our people could sense it. The king believes you were sent by the gods." "The king," Kyle said quietly, "can believe whatever comforts him. I'm not here as an answer to his prayers. I'm here because I had nowhere else to run." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but destiny has a way of ignoring our intentions. Come, there's someone who wants to meet you." The throne room of Winterhold was not what Cale expected. She'd imagined something grand, something meant to impress through sheer scale and opulence. Instead, she found a space that was intimate despite its size, designed in perfect proportions that made the eye want to linger. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting wolves and moons, and the floor was laid in a pattern of black and silver stone that formed a spiral when viewed from above. At the center of that spiral, On a throne that seemed carved from ice and starlight sat Theron. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another alpha, younger, with hair the color of old copper and eyes that held the particular cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. His tunic bore the sigil of the Eastern Pax, the emblem of Chaol's nightmares. Behind him stood a contingent of armed warriors, their hands resting on sword hilts in a posture that suggested they'd used them recently. "Kyle Northmere," the copper-haired alpha said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you here. Your pack has been searching for you extensively. There's a substantial reward for your return." Theron didn't move, but Kyle felt the temperature in the room drop, as if the king's displeasure was a physical force. "She's not returning anywhere," Theron said quietly. "She's under my protection now." "A rogue Omega?" The Eastern Alpha laughed. "Surely you don't expect us to believe that's anything more than a temporary arrangement. The girl is broken goods, damaged merchandise from a pack known for culling inferior stock. Whatever you think she is, Theron, she's not worth the diplomatic incident her presence here represents." Kyle's heart was racing. She could see the trap forming, the political machinery grinding into motion. She was a tool, she realized, a complication that could be weaponized. But then Theron rose from his throne. "You mistake my hospitality for negotiation," the king said, and there was something in his voice now that made even the Eastern Alpha's hand twitch toward his sword. "The girl came to my gates under her own power. She's a pathfinder, a rare gift, a connection to the old magic. She bears no pack mark now, which means she's bound by no hierarchy but her own. And she's made it clear she chooses to remain here." The king descended the steps of his throne, and with each one, the power in the room grew more concentrated, more visible. The ley lines in the stone began to glow beneath his feet, silver and deep blue light rising like breath. "She's not Northmere's to reclaim," Theron said, "and I'd advise you not to test whether she's mine to defend." There was a moment of perfect silence. Then the Eastern Alpha bowed, a gesture that was almost, but not quite, respectful. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We meant no offense. We simply wanted to ensure the girl hadn't been taken against her will." "She hadn't," Theron confirmed. "But now she has been given a choice, and she chooses to stay. Sarah will see you and your delegation to the guest quarters. You'll remain in Winterhold for 3 days, as tradition dictates. After that, you'll return to your territories and report that Chaol Northmere is no longer your concern." As the Eastern Alpha and his warriors were led from the throne room, Chaol felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 7 years being told that her only value was as a tool, as a function, as something to be controlled. And in one moment, one man had claimed her as something entirely different. When they were alone, Theron turned to her. His eyes had returned to their normal shade, but they were tired now, deeply, profoundly tired. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have warned you that your former pack would be making inquiries. They have allies among the Eastern territories. It was inevitable that word of your arrival would reach them eventually." Chaol moved closer, studying this alpha who claimed she could choose to stay. "Why didn't you send me away?" she asked. "It would have been simpler, less complicated." Theron was silent for a long moment. He moved to a window that overlooked the frozen valley, and he spoke with his gaze fixed on the landscape beyond. 3 years ago, he began, Winterhold had a pathfinder named Lysandra. She was brilliant, powerful, ancient in her magic. She could read the fate threads so clearly that she could see deaths before they happened, futures before they were written. He paused. "She died protecting me from an assassination I didn't see coming. She used her own life force to shield me, and there was nothing left of her afterward, not even ashes." His reflection in the window was fractured, broken into pieces by the old glass. "Since then, the kingdom has been adrift, Without a pathfinder, without the old magic to guide our choices, we've been making decisions blind. People have died because I couldn't see what was coming. Entire regions have failed because I was operating on hope instead of knowledge. He turned to face her. You're not just a pathfinder, Kale. You're a lifeline. And yes, that makes you valuable. But it also makes you necessary. And I find that I'm not willing to let you go without at least trying to convince you that staying might not be the worst choice you could make. His voice was raw with it, the honest confession of a king who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. Kale understood then. He wasn't trying to keep her as a prisoner. He was asking her to become a partner in something vast and terrible and necessary. If I stay, she said slowly, I'm not staying as a tool. I'm staying as someone who has a choice in how I'm used. Agreed, Theron said immediately. And I need to know what happened to Lysandra, the whole truth. Because if you're trying to replace her, I need to understand what I'm being asked to carry. Theron nodded. Come, there's someone you should meet. She's been waiting for you longer than any of us have known to look. The Tower of Remembrance stood at the northernmost point of Winterhold's walls, a structure that seemed to be built more of moonlight than stone. Kale climbed the spiral stairs behind Theron, her hand trailing along walls that hummed with old power, each step carrying her deeper into layers of magic that predated the kingdoms themselves. At the top was a chamber that didn't feel like it should exist. The walls curved inward like the interior of some great beast, and the ceiling opened to the sky. But it wasn't the winter sky of Winterhold. It was a sky of stars so thick and luminous that Kale had to shield her eyes, and beneath them, the landscape shifted. Mountains became forests, became deserts, became oceans, all visible at once, all present simultaneously. In the center of this impossible space stood a woman. She was old, older than old, her skin like parchment, her hair the color of moonlit frost, and her eyes were blind, pure white, utterly sightless. Yet as Kale entered, those eyes turned toward her with perfect accuracy. The one who fell at the gates, the woman said. Her voice was like wind through broken glass, dangerous and beautiful. The one who bore the collar and still refused to break. This is the Remembrancer, Theron said quietly. She keeps the threads of all fates that have ever been woven in Winterhold. She's been alive for longer than the kingdom itself. The Remembrancer moved forward, and Kale saw that her movements were not quite physical. She seemed to glide rather than walk, her form wavering slightly at the edges. You wonder why the king values you so highly, the Remembrancer continued. You believe it's because you're rare, because you carry the old magic. But you're wrong. She reached out a hand, and Kyle felt compelled to take it. The skin was cool, almost translucent, and when their hands touched, Kale's vision fractured. She saw, the moment Lysandra had died, seen from the inside of her own dying. The way the assassination had come from the shadows, from within Theron's own circle. The betrayal that had preceded it. A face she recognized, Lord Marin, the king's closest advisor. The slow drip of poison over months. The careful erosion of trust. She saw Theron's dreams in the years after Lysandra's death. The way he'd searched every ley line for another pathfinder. The way he'd grown harder, colder, his faith in the gods eroding with each dawn that brought no answer. She saw the exact moment Kale had fallen at his gates. The way her blood had written a pattern in the snow that Theron's own pathfinder gift could read. A pattern that said, she comes, and she saw. The reason the Eastern Alpha had come. The reason the timing was so perfect, so devastating. The threads had been leading to this moment, this convergence, this impossible choice. She saw war coming, shadows gathering at the edges of the kingdom, the ley lines fracturing, the barrier between the mortal world and something far older beginning to crack. When the Remembrancer released her hand, Kyle fell to her knees. The visions receded, but not entirely. They remained at the edge of her perception, true and terrible and demanding to be understood. "Do you see now?" the remembrancer asked gently. "You are not sent to save the king. You are sent to save the kingdom from the king's choices. You are sent to be the voice that says no when saying no will destroy everything. You are sent to be the witness that matters." Theron helped Kyle to her feet. She could feel him shaking, could sense that he'd seen something in this exchange, some understanding passing between the two women who carried the old sight. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. "Betrayal," Kale whispered, "and a choice that will break us both if we make it, but shatter the entire kingdom if we don't." She turned to look at him fully, and she saw the moment her gaze registered on his face. The Alpha King, powerful, ancient, marked by the magic of the first, looked at her with something that was almost like hope. "I need to tell you something," Kyle said, "about the rune work on my old collar, about the magic that's been binding me." She spent the next hour laying it out. How the Northmere Pack had used blood magic to suppress her Pathfinder gifts, keeping her just conscious enough to have visions they could use, but not conscious enough to understand them. How they'd been draining her power for years, storing it in the runes, building toward something. How the collar had been more than a chain, it had been a battery. If they remove that collar, Kale concluded, they lose access to its power. But more than that, whoever's been orchestrating this, whoever taught the Northmere elders how to work blood magic on this scale, they lose leverage over me, and I become dangerous to them in a new way. "Lord Marin," Theron said, understanding flooding his face. "Lord Marin," Kale confirmed, "the poison was never about killing you. It was about making you weak enough, desperate enough, to accept something. A prophecy, perhaps. A warning. Something that would push you toward a decision he wanted you to make." Theron's hand clenched into a fist, and the king who'd seemed almost gentle moments before was suddenly terrible. Suddenly the force of nature that kingdoms were built to contain. "He knew you were coming," Theron realized. "He's been waiting for you." "He's been preparing for me," Kyle corrected. "Whether he knew or not, the magic was arranged to make my arrival inevitable, to make my presence here a threat he could exploit." The remembrancer smiled, an expression of such sadness that Kale had to look away. "And now the threads begin to pull taut," the old woman said, "and now the choice becomes real." That night, Kale found herself unable to sleep. She moved through the corridors of the castle, following the glow of the ley lines, until she found herself in a chamber hung with ancient weapons. And there, working methodically to sharpen a blade that would never lose its edge, was Theron. He didn't look up as she entered, but his posture shifted, acknowledging her presence without denying it. "You're thinking about leaving," he said quietly, "calculating whether your presence here is worth the danger it brings." "I'm thinking about the fact that I've been a tool for everyone I've ever met," Kyle replied. "And now I'm being asked to be a tool for a king, even if that tool comes with a choice attached." Theron set down his blade and finally turned to face her. The firelight caught the silver scars that marked him, and she could see how deeply the past 3 years had cut into his bones. "You're right," he said. "I need you. Winterhold needs you. But more than that, I believe you want to stay. I believe there's a part of you that's tired of running, and the possibility of standing and fighting appeals to something fundamental in your nature." He stood, and he extended his hand to her, the same gesture he'd made 3 days ago at her bedside. "Stay not as a tool," he said. "Stay as the person who will tell me when I'm wrong. Stay as the witness that matters. Stay as the one who chooses every morning to remain." He paused. "And if you choose to leave, I'll let you go, and I'll use whatever power I have to ensure you're never hunted again." Kale looked at his extended hand. She thought about the collar, about the years beneath it, about the terrible clarity of the visions the Remembrancer had shared. And for the first time in her life, she reached out and took the hand of an Alpha not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Their fingers intertwined, and the silver scars on her skin flared with power. The gods had sent her to the gates of Winterhold for a reason. And now, as the winter deepened and the shadows gathered at the edges of the kingdom, Kale was beginning to understand what that reason might be. If your heart beats alongside ours, tell us, where in the world are you right now, and at what hour do these northern confessions find you? Leave a trace of your presence in the comments. We wish to know how far these stories of redemption travel, and at what moments of the night they reach those who need them. The morning of the third day, Kale woke to the smell of blood. Not fresh blood, something older, something that had been drying for hours, oxidizing into a copper-rust ghost of what it had been. She dressed quickly and followed the scent through the corridors of Winterhold until she found herself in the royal chambers. Theron was standing over the body of Lord Merrin. The old advisor lay on the floor in a pool of his own creation, a ceremonial dagger buried to the hilt in his chest. His eyes were still open, the expression frozen in an instant of shock, as if he'd never truly believed the king would dare. "He came at dawn," Theron said quietly, not turning to face her. "He had soldiers with him, loyal to him, or loyal to the promises he'd made them. I didn't stop to ask. There was a scuffle. He lost." Kale moved closer, careful not to disturb the body. She could feel the residue of magic that lingered in the blood, could read the story it told. There was poison in it, the same poison that had been slow dripping through Theron's veins for months. But there was something else too, a compulsion, a binding, a magical contract. "He was controlled," Kale said. "Someone else was pulling the threads." Theron finally turned to face her. His eyes were haunted, and there was blood on his hands that wasn't Merrin's. "I've been expecting this," he said. "Ever since you arrived, I've been waiting for the next move. The Eastern Alpha's visit wasn't random. It was a test. They wanted to see how far I'd go to protect you, how much I valued you above loyalty to my own people." "And?" Kyle asked. "And apparently I'd be willing to watch my kingdom burn," Theron replied bitterly. "Marin came this morning with an ultimatum. Give you up, or he'd reveal everything to the council. The blood magic I've been using to keep the ley lines stable, the forbidden rituals. The bargain I made with the old gods years ago to save Lysandra's life." He laughed, a sound without humor, broken and sharp. "He didn't know I'd already failed," Theron continued. "That Lysandra died anyway, after I'd given up half my lifespan to save her. That the gods took my sacrifice and gave me nothing but empty years in return." He looked at his hands, at the blood now staining them. "When he tried to draw his blade, I moved faster than I've moved in years. The dagger was in my hand before I thought about it, and then it was in him." Kyle's wolf half recognized something in him then, the particular devastation of an Alpha who'd crossed a line he'd sworn never to cross. The blood in the water, the fracture in the seal, the first step toward darkness. "Help me hide the body," Kyle said. Theron looked at her in shock. "What?" "We don't have time for guilt," Kyle said. She was already moving, already pulling the tapestries from the walls, already thinking through the logistics. "We hide this, we clean the blood, we let Merrin simply disappear. By the time his absence is noted, it'll be impossible to prove he was ever here. The Eastern Alpha's delegation is leaving this morning. No one will miss him until they're gone." "Kyle, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," she interrupted. "I'm choosing. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there and let your guilt destroy everything?" For a moment, Theron was still. Then something shifted in his expression, the weight of grief temporarily set aside, replaced by the hard practicality of survival. They worked through the morning, moving Marin's body to a place beneath the castle where the old magic ran too thick for normal scavengers to disturb. Theron knew the tunnels, knew the secret places where kings hid their shame. When they emerged hours later, they were both soaked in sweat, and the stone above them held its secrets close. The Eastern delegation left at midday, the copper-haired Alpha bowing with almost respect to Theron as they departed. There was something in his gaze that suggested he knew exactly what had happened, and that he approved. He wanted Marin dead, Cale realized as they watched the retinue disappear into the snow. He was testing whether you'd have the spine to do it. If I pass his test, what then? Theron asked. Then you'll have made an alliance with a predator, Cale replied. And predators always eat eventually, but for now, you've bought us time. That evening, Sarah came to Cale's chamber. The healer's sister moved with purpose, and her eyes held the particular clarity of someone who knew exactly what had happened and was choosing to say nothing. The king would like you to begin your duties tomorrow, Sarah said. As the Pathfinder of Winterhold, you'll need to read the ley lines daily. The council will want to see you, to verify your legitimacy. There will be those who question your presence here, who see you as a rogue or a threat. She paused. And there will be those who see you as something else entirely. What? Kyle asked. A weapon, Sarah replied simply. And weapons, by their nature, can cut anyone, even the hand that wields them. After Sarah left, Kyle stood at her window and looked out over Winterhold. The city was beginning to prepare for the deep winter, the season when the ice locked everything in place for months. In some places, the snow drifted higher than the buildings themselves. She thought about the body buried beneath the castle. She thought about Theron's hands, stained with blood that couldn't be washed clean with water alone. She thought about the choice she'd made and the consequences it would ripple outward like stone dropping into still water. And she understood finally that redemption was never simple, that mercy could curdle into complicity. That saving a king might mean becoming the very thing you'd run from. But when she touched the silver scars on her skin, the marks of the old magic, the visible proof that she carried power in her own right, she knew she wouldn't run again. The threads were taut now, the loom was spinning, and Cale Northmere, who had been property and tool and broken thing, was about to become something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The throne room was packed with the minor lords and ladies of Winterhold, their finery bright against the dark stone, their eyes sharp as stars. They'd assembled at dawn, called by royal decree, to witness something that hadn't happened in 3 years, the presentation of a new Pathfinder. Cale stood before them in garments that felt like armor, a dress of deep blue silk trimmed with silver, her hair bound in the traditional style of Winterhold's seers, her neck bare of any mark or collar. The absence of restriction felt almost more binding than chains. Theron sat on his throne, his posture perfect, his expression carefully neutral. No one who didn't know him would see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the armrests a fraction too tightly. "This is Cale," Theron announced, his voice carrying through the chamber with the weight of ancient authority. "She comes to Winterhold as a pathfinder of the First Order, marked by the old magic, bearer of the sight that sees through veils. She will serve as my personal advisor and the kingdom's bridge to the threads of fate. Her word carries the weight of my word. Her decisions carry the authority of this throne." He paused, letting that sink in. Anyone who questions her legitimacy may do so now, or may hold their tongue forever and accept her as law. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that can crush empires. Then a woman stood. She was older, her hair shot through with silver, her dress marking her as the Countess of the Eastern Valley, a territory Theron relied on for grain and soldiers both. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "no one questions the Pathfinder's legitimacy. We question the wisdom of appointing someone so newly arrived to a position of such authority. Surely a period of assessment would be appropriate?" It was a reasonable question, the kind that couldn't be answered with threats. "The lady raises a fair point," came another voice, a younger lord from the western reaches. "We've had no pathfinder for 3 years. To suddenly appoint one, with no time for the kingdom to acclimate to her presence or her interpretations of the threads. It seems hasty." Kyle felt the weight of their skepticism, their fear. They saw her as an unknown quantity, a potential threat. In a kingdom where magic and power were intertwined, where the Pathfinder's word could determine battles and marriages and the fate of bloodlines, no lord would simply accept her without verification. Theron was about to respond when Kale stepped forward. "I can prove it," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the chamber with a clarity that made several of the assembled nobles flinch. "If you'll allow me access to the ley lines, I can read the threads that bind this kingdom. I can tell you things about yourselves, about your secrets, about your futures that no one else could know. That's how a Pathfinder proves herself." There was a murmur of approval, mixed with fear. This was how it worked. A seer earned trust by demonstrating knowledge that seemed impossible. "Let her try," the Countess said, and there was something almost kind in her voice. "We can convene in the Chamber of Mirrors. If she can read even 3 of us correctly, we'll accept her." Theron shot Kale a look, a warning, an apology, a request for forgiveness. He'd known this would happen. He'd probably been hoping she'd refuse. But Kale was already moving toward the chamber, her heart steady, the silver scars on her skin beginning to glow with power. The Chamber of Mirrors was exactly as its name suggested. A room lined entirely with reflective surfaces, creating an infinite receding gallery of images. It was designed to confuse and disorient anyone without the old sight. For a Pathfinder, it was a tool of unprecedented power. Kale stood in the center, and she let the gifts she'd been suppressing for 7 years flow free. The mirrors showed her more than reflections. They showed her the threads of magic that bound each person to the kingdom, to fate itself. She could see the Countess's thread. It was red, the color of passion and danger. It showed Kale that the lady's son was planning to marry against her wishes, that she was terrified of losing control, that she wove her dominance so tightly it was beginning to strangle her bloodline. She could see the young Western Lord's thread, blue and fractured, showing a mind that was beginning to splinter. Sickness approaching. A poison, perhaps, not physical, but mental. The kind of corruption that comes from making too many compromises with one's conscience. She could see, with perfect clarity, exactly how to break them. But instead, she told them the truth. "The Countess fears the future," Kyle said, her voice steady, "because she's built her entire identity around control. Her son will marry outside her wishes. It will break her heart and strengthen him beyond measure. She'll either learn to accept his autonomy, or she'll lose him entirely." The Countess's face went pale. "The Lord from the West is sick," Kale continued. "Not with anything physical, with the knowledge that he betrayed someone he cared for to climb in his father's estimation. He has 5 years before the guilt makes him move, 5 years to make recompense, or 5 years to prepare his final descent." The young man looked physically ill. "But," Kyle said, her voice dropping to something almost tender, "I see threads of redemption in both of you. The Countess will learn to love her son as an adult rather than a property. The Lord will find the courage to atone. Your futures are not written. They're merely visible." She turned to face the assembled nobles who'd crowded the threshold of the chamber. "That's what a Pathfinder does," she said. "Not predicts with absolute certainty, but reads the threads and tells you what they're saying. Some of you will be relieved by what you hear. Some of you will be terrified, but all of you will know the truth. And truth is the foundation on which kingdoms survive." The silence was different this time. It held less fear and more respect. "The Countess was right to challenge me," Kale concluded. "Power without accountability is indistinguishable from tyranny. I welcome your questions. I invite your skepticism. and I will answer with honesty every time. By the time she walked out of the Chamber of Mirrors, she'd won them. Not their love, perhaps not even their full trust, but their acceptance. Theron was waiting for her in the corridor. "You told her truth instead of using leverage," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "She deserved it," Kyle replied. "They all did. If I'd used my sight as a weapon to control them, I would have become exactly what I was running from. Another person wielding power to bend others to my will." Theron studied her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. "You're going to be better at this than Lysandra ever was," he said quietly. "Because you understand that power is nothing without mercy." She could see the threads, but she couldn't quite bring herself to tell people the hard truths. "Or maybe she just didn't want to hurt people," Kyle said. "Perhaps," Theron acknowledged. "But kindness that refuses to name suffering is just another form of cruelty." He led her through the castle, down corridors she hadn't seen before, until they reached a chamber that seemed almost hidden. Inside was a library, shelf upon shelf of ancient texts, many of them written in languages that predated the modern kingdoms. "This was Lysandra's study," Theron said. "I've kept it sealed since her death. But if you're going to be the Pathfinder for Winterhold, you need to understand what came before you. You need to know the history of the magic you're inheriting." Kyle moved through the library slowly, running her fingers along the spines of books bound in leather that might have been older than the kingdom itself. And there, on a desk near the window, she found a journal written in a hand that still seemed to carry its writer's heartbeat. She opened it carefully and began to read. Lysandra's journal was less a record of events and more a confession written to a god who might not be listening. Kale spent 3 days immersed in it, emerging only for meals and brief conversations with Theron and Sarah. The words written in that careful, beautiful hand told a story that was both inspiration and warning. "I can see too much. This is the curse of the Pathfinder, to witness all possible futures, to understand the threads that bind every soul, and to be forever unable to pretend that the suffering I see is anything other than real." Theron asked me today if I could see a future in which he finds happiness. I told him I could see one. I didn't tell him that it's the least likely of all the threads, that happiness, for a king, is almost impossible, that power and joy exist in opposition, that the weight of the crown crushes the ability to feel lightness. He wept when I finished, the first time I've ever seen him weep, and I realized then that my gift is not a blessing. It's a curse I'm forced to inflict on others. Further in the journal, Lysandra had written about the prophecy, the one that Marin had apparently been trying to trigger. "There are threads I cannot follow, ancient prophecies that predate even the first Omegas, woven into the very fabric of magic itself. One of them speaks of a Pathfinder who will become the bridge between kingdoms, who will refuse both the old hierarchies and the new tyrannies, who will choose mercy and thereby transform the nature of power itself. The prophecy has always been unclear. Is she liberation, or is she destruction wearing the face of salvation? I sometimes wonder if I should have worked harder to prevent it. Instead, I've been waiting, watching for the signs that suggest she's coming, and I've prepared what I could." At the very end of the journal, on the last page, was a single entry written in ink so fresh it seemed to shimmer. "If you're reading this, I'm dead. If you're reading this, you're the one I've been waiting for. The threads told me it would be an Omega, rejected by her first pack, marked by defiance and old magic. The threads told me it would hurt, for me, for Theron, for everyone involved. But the threads also showed me something else, a future in which the old hierarchies collapse entirely, in which Alpha and Omega are simply equal. And that future is worth dying for. So I'm going to do something forbidden. I'm going to reach out from beyond the veil, and I'm going to tie my remaining magic to the ley lines. I'm going to create a kind of beacon, a call that will reach across distances and time and draw the one who's meant to replace me. If you're reading this, the spell worked. You found your way to Winterhold. And now the real work begins. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for dying. I'm sorry for being unavailable to guide you. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on your shoulders. But I'm not sorry for believing that you could carry it. When Kyle reached the end, she was crying. She didn't know this woman who'd been dead for 3 years, but she understood her completely. She understood the particular loneliness of seeing too much, of knowing too much, of being unable to unknow what the threads had shown you. She found Theron in the throne room, working through documents with an expression of deep weariness. When he saw her face, he set down his pen immediately. "Lysandra called me here," Kyle said. "She cast a spell, a beacon from beyond the veil. She knew I was coming. She orchestrated my arrival." Theron's expression didn't change. "Yes." "And you knew this?" Kyle's voice rose slightly. "I knew it was likely," Theron replied. Lysandra was always reaching toward the future, always trying to guide events before they happened. I suspected that her death might not have been an ending for her, that she might have had enough power to echo beyond it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cale demanded. "Because," Theron said, rising from his seat, "I needed you to believe that you were choosing to stay. If I'd told you that Lysandra had orchestrated your arrival, you would have felt like a puppet. And I needed you to be a partner, not a tool." He moved closer, his eyes carrying the weight of 3 years of grief. "I still need that. I still need you to believe that your choices matter, even if the threads suggested you would make them." Cale understood then the particular trap of prophecy, the way it could consume free will even without physically binding anyone, the way knowing the future could turn people into actors in someone else's play. "I'm going to read Lysandra's full work," Cale said. "I'm going to understand everything she wrote, everything she foresaw. And if there's something else you're not telling me, something about my presence here, something about why I matter so much, I need to hear it." "When you're ready," Theron said. "There's something in the ley lines themselves. A message, perhaps, or a warning. Only a pathfinder can read it directly. I've been waiting for you to be strong enough to understand it." "Then I'll read it tomorrow," Kyle said, "and we'll know, both of us, exactly what we're walking into." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for waiting, for believing I would choose to stay even without knowing the thread suggested it, for letting me have something that looked like freedom, even if it was shaped by prophecy." Theron smiled. A real smile. The first genuine expression of joy she'd seen on his face since she arrived. "That's all any of us can do, really," he replied. "Shape things to look like freedom, and hope that the looking is honest enough to become real. Comment Luna if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw your worth. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. Your voice joins the chorus of those who understand. Redemption is not granted. It's chosen again and again in the face of darkness." Cale descended into the deep places beneath Winterhold before dawn, carrying nothing but a single candle and the old words Lysandra had written in the margins of her journal. The ley lines ran closest to the surface in the oldest chambers, the ones that predated the kingdom by centuries. She found herself in a cavern that seemed to exist outside of normal space. The stone walls glowed with their own light, soft silver blue, the color of moonlight on frozen water. And running through the cavern like veins, like arteries, were threads of pure magic. The threads were infinite. They branched and rejoined and split again, each one representing a possible future, a possible timeline. Some threads led to darkness. Some led to light. Most led to something far too complex to be labeled either way. But there was one thread that seemed to call to her specifically. It was woven with silver and blood, ancient and new simultaneously. It thrummed with power that made her entire body ache. She reached out to touch it, and the vision consumed her. She saw a time before the kingdoms, when the old gods still walked in the world. A society of alphas and omegas living in true equality, their power balanced, their hierarchies fluid and chosen rather than enforced. She saw the betrayal that had broken it. An alpha who wanted to consolidate power, who saw the balance as weakness. He'd rewritten the magic, twisted the natural order, created chains that made it impossible for omegas to refuse. Over generations, that twisted order had become normal, had become law, had become the very foundation of the world. She saw Lysandra, 300 years ago, in a life that hadn't quite happened yet, understanding this truth and dying rather than living in a world built on that foundation. She saw herself standing in a circle surrounded by the powers of Winterhold, making a choice that would either shatter the old order or consolidate it forever. She saw Theron kneeling before her, accepting something that no Alpha King had ever accepted before. She saw a world that hadn't existed for 1,000 years, beginning to bloom again. When the vision released her, Kale was on her knees on the stone floor, and tears were streaming down her face. Because she understood now. She understood why Lysandra had orchestrated her arrival. She understood why the prophecy was both liberation and destruction. She understood what Theron had been asking her to do when he looked at her with those ancient eyes. She was supposed to break the order of the world. When she returned to the castle, Theron was waiting for her in the courtyard. His face was gray, exhausted. He'd been having visions too, reading the same threads through the deep magic that bound them both. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw it," Cal confirmed. "The original order. The way it was broken. The way it could be broken again, this time toward justice instead of away from it." "And?" Theron asked, and his voice carried everything, fear, hope, the terrible weight of knowing what might be coming. "And I need to know if you're willing," Kale said, "because what I'm seeing requires sacrifice from you. It requires you to choose something other than power, other than legacy, other than the continuation of the Alpha King's dominion." Theron was silent for a long moment. The snow fell around them, gentle and inexorable. "What does it require of you?" he asked finally. "Everything," Cal said simply. "My blood, my magic, probably my life. The prophecy isn't clear on whether I survive what I'm about to do." "Then I won't ask you to do it," Theron said immediately. "It's not your choice," Kyle replied. "I'm going to do it anyway. The only question is whether you'll help me or whether you'll stand against me." Theron looked at her. Really looked at her with the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, lost too much, hurt too much to deny the truth when it presented itself. "If I help you," he said slowly, "I'm choosing to end the reign of the Alpha Kings. I'm choosing to make myself equal to Omegas, to give up the magic that sustained my bloodline for 1,000 years." "Yes," Kale said. "And if I do that," Theron continued, "the other kingdoms will see it as weakness. They'll attack. They'll try to take what we've created and pervert it back into the old order." "Almost certainly," Kale agreed. "And you're asking me to do this anyway, to give up everything on faith that it's the right choice." "I'm not asking," Kale said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do. You can choose to join me, or you can choose to stop me. Those are your options." Theron laughed, a sound of pure, crystalline despair. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you said that," he said quietly. "The moment you claimed your own agency so completely that you left no room for me to make you dependent on my choices." He reached out and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined, and the silver scars on both their skin flared with power, bright enough to cast shadows on the snow. "Tell me what I need to do," Theron said. "Tell me how to help you unmake the world." The ceremony took place during the new moon. the time when the barrier between the known world and the realm of the old gods was thinnest. Kyle had spent a week preparing, fasting, and meditating, building up her power until every cell in her body hummed with the ancient magic. The throne room had been transformed into a ritual space. The spiral pattern on the floor had been redrawn in salt and blood, and at its center stood 2 thrones, one of ice and starlight, one of earth and shadow. They faced each other rather than sitting at angles, a fundamental change in the geometry of power. The council had been gathered, the minor lords and ladies of Winterhold, the Remembrancer herself, brought down from her tower of impossible things. Sarah stood to one side, her healer's role transformed into something more sacred. She would bear witness and record what happened here, that future generations might understand. Kyle stood in the center of the spiral, clothed in a dress of pure silver silk, her hair unbound and falling to her knees. Theron stood opposite her, still wearing the formal dress of an Alpha King, but with one crucial addition. He wore the iron collar. It was his choice. He'd asked Kale to place it on him herself, as symbol of the choice he was making. The collar bore no runes of binding or subjugation, but rather the same symbols that marked a pathfinder, the scars of the old magic, the marks of one who could bridge worlds. "We gather," Kyle began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber and beyond, into the ley lines themselves, to witness the end of one age and the beginning of another. She moved toward Theron, and he moved toward her until they stood in the center of the spiral, so close their breath mingled. "For 1,000 years," Kale continued, "the Alpha Kings ruled. They carried the old magic, channeled the power of the gods, and imposed order through dominance. Many flourished under this system. Many suffered. It was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but it was complete. It was total. It left no room for other ways of being." She reached out and touched the collar at Theron's throat, a gentle touch, acknowledging the weight of what it represented. "And I say," she said, "that it's over." She pulled the collar from his neck with a gesture, and the iron simply crumbled into dust, into ash, into nothing. The magical bindings that had held it together for 1,000 years unraveled like thread pulled from cloth. "I say," she continued, "that we create something new, something in which the gifts are not hoarded by the few, but shared by the many. Something in which an omega is not less, but different. Something in which power is not a throne, but a choice." She took his hand, and together they walked to the 2 thrones, but instead of sitting in them, they destroyed them. The ice throne shattered, the shadow throne crumbled. Together, they reduced the symbols of absolute rule to nothing. In their place rose something new. 2 seats, equal in height, equal in craft, woven from both ice and earth, both starlight and shadow. The marriage thrones, the Remembrancer would later call them, thrones that could only be occupied by 2 who chose to share power. "I claim the title of Pathfinder," Kale said, and her voice was thunder, was lightning, was the sound of the world remembering what it had been. Not as advisor to a king, but as guardian of the threads themselves. "I claim the right to read fate and offer guidance, but I renounce the right to command obedience. I offer wisdom, and I accept that it may be refused." She sat in one throne, and the moment her body touched it, the silver scars on her skin flared with light so bright that several of the observers had to shield their eyes. "I claim the title of Keeper," Theron said, and his voice was equally powerful, equally certain. "I maintain the kingdom's heart, but I renounce dominance. I accept Kale as my equal in all things. I accept that wisdom can come from any source, that strength takes many forms, that power is nothing without consent." He sat in the 2nd throne, and as he did, the collar around his neck, the voluntary collar, the symbol of his choice, transformed. It became not a chain but a crown, a circlet of silver and iron interwoven, marking him as one who'd chosen to bind himself to something greater than his own will. The ley lines throughout Winterhold began to reshape themselves. Kyle could feel it through her connection to the threads, the ancient magic responding to the change, the very fabric of the kingdom realigning to accommodate this new structure. It was painful and beautiful and utterly transformative. Some of the minor lords began to leave, their faces reflecting shock and outrage. Others remained, watching with expressions that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally be brave enough to break the cycle. When the ceremony was complete, when Chaol and Theron rose from their thrones as equals rather than as ruler and subject, the castle itself had changed. The tapestries had shifted, now depicting wolves and omegas side by side, not one above the other. The stone had softened, become less aggressive, more welcoming. "There will be war," Sarah said quietly as they walked through the transformed halls. "The other kingdoms won't accept this. They'll see it as contagion." "Probably," Cal agreed, "but we'll face it together. And maybe, if we survive it, the contagion will spread." She turned to Theron, who walked beside her with his collar crown catching the light. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "I spent my entire life learning to rule from above, learning to make decisions for others, to carry the weight of the kingdom on my shoulders alone. And now you're asking me to share that burden, to accept that I don't have all the answers." "I'm not asking," Chaol said with the ghost of a smile. "I'm insisting." That night, alone in a chamber that was no longer the royal chambers because royalty had been fundamentally redefined, Chaol read the final entry in Lysandra's journal. It was a page she'd somehow missed before, or perhaps it had revealed itself only now, when the prophecy had finally come to fruition. "If you succeed, if you truly transform the nature of power itself, then I can finally rest. The spell I cast doesn't require servitude anymore. It requires freedom. Know that I'm no longer bound to the ley lines, no longer trapped in the channels of magic. You freed me. You freed everyone. And Theron, if you're listening from wherever you exist on the other side of the veil, thank you. Thank you for being strong enough to break." Chaol carefully closed the journal and set it on the altar where sacred texts were kept. In the morning, she would begin the real work, integrating the new order, facing the councils and the other kingdoms, defending the choices she and Theron had made. But tonight, she stood at the window and looked out over Winterhold, and she allowed herself to simply rest. The rebellion had succeeded, the old order had cracked, and something new was beginning to grow through the fissures. It would not be easy. It might fail. But for the first time in her life, Chaol had not been moved by external forces. She had moved herself, had chosen her path with full knowledge of the consequences, and that, she understood, was the true definition of freedom. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe, because every soul that joins this story keeps the flame of redemption alive. We began in rejection and exile, and we chose to end in transformation and grace. You've witnessed the unmaking of the old world and the birth of something that has never existed before. Share where you listen to this story. Tell us what this ending means to you, because these threads don't end here. They continue into the world, reaching toward anyone brave enough to believe that power can be chosen, shared, and ultimately transfigured into something sacred. We are Moonblood Chronicles, and the moon keeps burning for those who remember to look up.